All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here with Jack Williams today, former politician in Alabama politics. It's great to come on and answer a few questions. Jack, how are you doing, man?
Good, good. How are you, Christopher?
Hey, I can't complain. I appreciate this opportunity to talk to you. I remember the first time we ever talked was in '94 in Governor James' race, and there'll be much of stuff for volunteer for his campaign. When did you first get involved in politics?
Um, 1982. I was trying to finish up college, and I read a book by a pretty well-known author at the time, a guy named Francis Schaeffer, called The Christian Manifesto. And the book talked about how Christians can get involved in the political process and just get involved in their communities. And I'd always been interested and followed political stuff. And I went down and volunteered on two campaigns. I volunteered on the Emory Farmer for governor campaign, and he lost to Governor Wallace. And I volunteered on the Albert Lee Smith for Congress campaign, and he was the incumbent congressman, and he got beat. He turns out he had been drawn out of his district, and that's when Ben Erdrich took over. So I have a rather interesting story from that first campaign. If you got time for it,
because that was they call it the first modern or governor's race or something to that effect.
Yeah, that was the first time Republicans had really put up a big can. Well, in '66, Jim Martin ran for governor, but this was the first. This was 16 years later, so this was the first time we'd had a real legitimate. Guy Hunt ran in '78, but didn't have any real resources. So, and I don't know what part are you from Birmingham, Christopher?
I grew up in Blount County, lived in Birmingham my whole life. Recently moved back to Blount. That's the first memory I have of politics is my dad holding me up to vote for Wallace in the runoff over McMillan.
Same that election year. So there used to be a little community place over on 2nd Avenue South called Cascade Plunge, over in the Wahoma community in Eastlake.
Okay.
And we this is probably about 80th Street or somewhere over in there. And the street's wide enough to be 4 lanes, but nobody had a garage, so people parked on the street. And then when it got to Cascade Plunge, it kind of widened out. And we were putting up signs election morning, and it's about 4 o'clock in the morning. And I'm walking this way down the street's on my left, and I hear a noise behind me. And I turn around and there's a car coming up the sidewalk trying to run over me. So I jumped out of the way and I ran across the road and told my friend that I was with, we got to get out of here. So we jumped in the car, and these guys were throwing rocks at our cars, and one of them was waving a gun. And we took off and went down, and we turned north and got up to 1st Avenue North, and these guys are following us. So we took a ride on 1st Avenue North, going away from town, and this is, we're probably in the upper 60s, lower 70s as far as the cross streets are on 1st Avenue North, and these guys have caught up with us, and they're trying to run us off the road. And my friend's freaking out, and he's like, "What are we going to do?" And I said, "We're going to the Eastlake Police Precinct," which at the time was 2nd Avenue North and 85th Street. So we take off, avoid them hitting us or running us off the road. And my friend drives past 85th Street. And I'm screaming, "You missed the turn, you missed the turn." And he cuts a big old U-turn. Kind of look, if you remember the show Starsky and Hutch, it kind of looks like that big turn they make in the intro to Starsky and Hutch. And his car dies. and he can't get the car to crank. And these two guys come jumping out of the car and they come running over. And this was before aluminum cans. And Hal, my friend, wore glasses, and one of the guys slams a beer can that was not aluminum against his head, breaks his glasses, and one of them has a hatchet, and they start smashing our windshield.
Hi.
And we had gotten threats, so we always carried a gun around with us. And my friend Hal yells, "Jack, get the gun." And I reach down for the gun, and before I can get my hands on it, I hear some guy say, "Yeah, Jack, get the gun." And I look up at the wrong end of two gun barrels.
Oh, God.
And I didn't see what a third gun would add to this, so I just put the gun, never pulled the gun out. And one of the guys says, "Let's whoop his ass." So they come running around to get me. And the reason the guy's car wouldn't crank was because it was still in drive. So he slipped it up into neutral, cranked his car, and we went around the corner to the police precinct, and they took off. And that was my first election day.
Oh.
But I'll tell you a funny story to go with that. There was a guy volunteering at the Republican Party headquarters, and I came by the headquarters that day, and people were laughing at me about what happened. And this guy got really angry, and he said, "Do you realize he could have been killed? This isn't funny, and this is an attack on democracy." And this guy was a businessman out on the eastern side of town. He retired and moved to Florida. And the first time I ran for office, he called me and said, and I hadn't heard from him in years. This was 96. I probably hadn't heard from him in 12 years. And he calls me and says, "I hear you're running for office." And I said, "That's right." And he says, "Well, can I send you some money?" And he sent me a contribution. And every time I ran, which was twice for tax collector, 4 times for the legislature, and once for the county commission, so 7 times, every time I ran, he sent me money. And it was all because of what I went through that night.
So did you ever think that Mayor Fulmer had a chance against Governor Wallace?
Sure I did, because everybody I was talking to was for Mayor Fulmer. And
But
I knew it was not a battle, but I was young and I just believed whatever they told us. And they said, "Yeah, we can win." And so we went out and did it, except we didn't win. So
a friend of mine told me that he's up in his mid-70s, and I think there was actually something called the Bradley effect about a guy in California ran for office. But he told me that every race that just about Governor Wallace was in, people thought he was going to lose. They said people were saying they weren't going to vote for him, and then when they got in there in the booth, they was voting for Governor Wallace.
And he did a really good job. That's how he won the Democrat primary against George McMillan, of making amends with the Black community for his stands in the 60s. And honestly, I didn't agree with a lot with some of what he did, but he was way ahead of his time on racial reconciliation with folks he had vehemently opposed politically.
I got put on a podcast one night that I really wasn't expecting to speak about Governor Wallace, and I wish he'd let me knock some of the rust off. But a lot of people don't realize that he was the NAACP candidate in 1958 when he ran against John Patterson.
Yep.
And he switched. But I want to touch on one thing with that race with McMillan. Good friends with George McMillan. Talked to him last week. He hardly ever. He'll talk to me some about that, but you can just tell that race tore him up. Another friend of mine who was on the Democratic committee at the time told me, he said they had actually called the race for McMillan, and he said about 11 o'clock that night, the numbers just suddenly tightened, and Governor Wallace had spent all his time down in the Black Belt campaigning, and instead of getting, 10% of the vote. He was getting 35 and 40% of the vote in these counties, and that was what was ended up being the difference, was him apologizing and working there.
I don't remember the race. I don't remember that aspect because I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the Democrat race, but I do know that folks were surprised, that they felt like because of his past history, that in a runoff, with there being a Republican primary, that it might hurt Governor Wallace. And I think it was, as I recall, it was a close race, but I don't remember how close.
I think the final vote count was 610,000 for Governor Wallace and 588 for George.
Yeah.
So then 4 years later, so you were working a Republican then when it first started. I guess Mayor Fulmer regrets not getting in that race in '86.
And I don't know, honestly. At the time of the '86 race, Marty Connors was executive director of the Republican Party, and I started working with Marty in '87. So we've talked about that before, and I'm not sure if the Democrats would have been so brazen had they felt like, had Emory Fulmer been the nominee. But I think they felt like, well, Guy Hunt ran in '78, didn't crack 30% of the vote, and they really misjudged people's reaction to their decision. And I think coupled with that, you had the '83 special elections where they handpicked all the candidates, and there was a lot of frustration at that time with the Democrat Party.
I'm still that was the first race that I really got into, and I still adore Bill Baxley to this day. I talked to him yesterday. I was supposed to have lunch with him again at the first of the year. To this day, I'm still friends with him. And I'll tell you a cool story about him that I thought was real neat. Before I touch on that race, I wrote him a letter. I was like 8 years old, and wrote him a letter and told him how I wanted him to win and blah blah blah. And this was when him and Graddick were going through the court battles. And no, actually, I think they'd handed it back to him. But I got a call. It was in the summer, and I got a phone call one morning. And my parents woke me up. It was like 8 a.m. And they said, "You got a phone call." 8 years old. Who's calling me? And I picked the phone up. Hello, and it said, "This is Lieutenant Governor Baxley. I received your letter as of yesterday. I just want to thank you for your support and your enjoyment in politics. And when I'm governor, I'm going to send a limousine to come pick you up, and you're going to be my guest at my inauguration." And I just thought that was so genuine, because anybody else just could have their secretary type something out and stamp it, but he took the time. An 8-year-old kid.
That's pretty neat.
Yeah, I thought it was. So that, in that race, Charlie Graddick was Republican, become a Democrat, and he urges the Republicans to cross over and vote for him, and nips Baxley. And a friend said, Al Appier said, he told them, said, we're making a huge mistake. We're misjudging this. And even my grandfather, the first Republican, of course, he ever voted for was Reagan, but this man always voted Democrat, and he was so enraged that that they took his vote away, that he voted for Graddick, and he got a million voters. So I guess my question is, how long do you think the Democratic Party could have held on without that race? Because even without it, started switching.
Well, I'll give you this as an answer. That was 1986, and it was 24 years later before Republicans took over the legislature.
Sure, that's a good point.
So I have a friend from Greenville who told me once that his daddy always voted in the Democrat primary, but in the general election, he didn't vote for any Democrat that had any responsibility north of Greenville. So for Congress and statewide races, my parents at the state level, and I grew up in rural Coleman and rural Walker County, and my parents became, in contrast to a lot of the state, my parents became state Republicans, but for the most part, nationally, they voted for Democrats, and I would think some of that probably had to do with my involvement in Republican politics. But in 2000, my parents voted for Roy Moore for the Alabama Supreme Court and Al Gore for president.
Okay. I mean, that's pretty broad spectrums there.
Yeah.
In that race, was you involved in Governor Hunt's campaign, or was you involved in Fobbs?
Let's see, 86. I was involved in the Denton campaign.
And who now? Oh, you
Jeremiah
was
Denton.
yes,
I was involved in the Denton campain.
that's a good. Okay, I've got a great question for you then, because I think this would be a great study for people in politics. You know, the Democrats, I think Governor Hunt carries 56, 58% of the vote. Then you've got an incumbent senator that loses re-election. How does that happen?
Jeremiah Denton, Admiral Senator Jeremiah Denton never stopped being an admiral. And he was mission focused, and he lost a lot of votes when he said he didn't have time to come back and pat babies on the butt. He was busy doing the people's business in Washington. And he had an abrasive personality, and he was rigid on the issues, and just honestly, he didn't relate well to people. Great patriot, a very good senator from a vote standpoint, but he just didn't suffer fools well.
A friend of mine who was on the executive Democratic committee in Baldwin County, of all places. I don't know if he's still on it or not. I haven't talked to him in a few years, but he told me a story about that one night. He said that he was actually working at a package store, and some aide that he knew well. I said, "Hey, come by Congressman's suite over here and have a drink and watch the returns." He said the returns started coming in, and Senator Shelby was way behind, and he said they kept having one shot after another, and finally went ahead. And the Associated Press called the race that the senator was not in the right shape to go out and speak to the people, so he couldn't make his victory speech to the next morning.
Well, if I remember correctly, that race was initially called for Shelby. I mean for Denton, and then they reversed the call.
Wow. That had to be tough to take right there. You know, Bill had told me because I was talking about the races. He said he wanted to get in the runoff of Fobb. He said because he was really worried that he said he would be in trouble if he got into the Braddock.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
So Governor Hunt takes office, and he 4 years later, you have a crowded Democratic field again. I'm guessing the Democratic Party's thinking that this will aberration, but Governor Hunt actually had got voted one of the most progressive governors in America.
Yeah. He was a lot smarter than he got credit for being.
And he doesn't, I love Governor Folsom. Still, I haven't talked to him in a while, but Governor Hunt doesn't give the credit for getting Mercedes here. I mean, he got the ball. Nobody ever gives Governor Hunt credit for that.
Yeah. It's it's funny. People didn't believe the charges against him. They felt like he got railroaded. That, I think, played as big a role in the success Republicans had as the Braddock Baxley thing did. And folks felt like he got treated wrong. But so they didn't believe he was a bad guy, but they never realized all the positive things he did.
Yeah, because yeah, that was going to be my next question about that too. I mean, how did they, learn your lesson? I remember when they went after him, and I was like, this is it. I mean, I've heard of a lot worse coming out of Montgomery, and this is all you've got on him. And so they remove a candidate they voted, and look what happened in '94. I've been pretty good about having an act for calling races, and I knew for some reason that Bob was going to win that year. And he had a tough fight with Senator Bledsoe and then Winton Blunt in the primary.
I was his campaign manager that year.
I remember, because that was the year that we talked on the phone a bunch.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So I called Governor James in February of 1993 and asked him if he would. I got his phone number from a friend and called him up. He answers the phone. And I said, Governor James, my name's Jack Williams. I'm the executive director of the House Republican Caucus, and I am the chairman of the Greater Birmingham Young Republicans. And I would like to see you run for governor as a Republican. And if you do that, I'll do anything I could to help you get elected. And he says, well, thank you very much. I appreciate your call, and hung up. And I'm like, okay. So I waited a week and called him back. And this time I asked him a question before he could hang up. And I called him at least once or twice a week for 10 months before he would ever even agree to meet with me. And so that summer we had a special session of the legislature. This was after Guy Hunt got thrown out, and we had a special session of the legislature and on ethics reform. And I'll be honest with you, I was concerned about Republicans' chances because I didn't think Ann Bedsolar, Winton Blunt would beat Jim Folsom.
No, they would not have.
And Jim, who I worked with when he was lieutenant governor, I was in the legislature, and I genuinely like. But I had prayed about it a lot, and I was convinced, just deep in my soul, that he was going to run and he was going to win. And that's why I kept calling him. And so during this special session, Ted Bryant was the reporter for the Birmingham Post-Herald. And Ted was a dear friend. And we're talking one day in the press room, and he goes, well, who you think? And there was a minister, I think his name was Mickey Kirkland out of Montgomery, that was in that race too.
Governor, yeah, I remember Mickey.
And Ted asked me, well, who do you think is going to win this race? Who's going to be the Republican nominee for governor? Winton Blunt or Ann Bedsoe? I said, I don't think either one of them are going to be the Republican nominee. And he said, well, you don't think that preacher's going to win, do you? And I said, no, I don't think he's going to win. I said, well, he said, well, I'm not aware of another candidate. Who's going to be the Republican nominee? And I said, it's going to be Fob James. And he said, Fob James is running for governor as a Republican. And I said, he is. He says, has he announced? And I said, no, not yet, but he's going to. And he said, are you sure? And I said, I'm positive. And so he says, have you talked to him? I said, yeah, we talk once or twice a week. And he said, and he's told you he's running for governor as a Republican. And I said, no, he hasn't told me, but I have it on very good authority. I've been told, but not by him. And he said, I can write this. And I said, you can write it. He's running. And he wrote that he was the guy that broke the story that Fob was going to run as a Republican. And that story went across the state, and it generated a little interest, and it died down. And we rolled around to December in the Republican midwinter meeting, and it was in Auburn that year. And I drove down on Friday night, came back to Birmingham on Saturday morning, went back for a 6 o'clock meeting with Fob and one of his old guys. And he asked me if I'd be willing to run his campaign. He said, if I decide to run, and he told me, he says, look, I don't want to run. I've been governor before. Ain't nothing exciting about it. I'd rather not run. But if I decide to run, will you be my campaign manager? I told him I would. And we negotiated a salary. And so I knew I couldn't go back to that same reporter and tell him that Fob had asked me to be the campaign manager, but I needed to bump the Fob James. I needed the Fob James story, needed to get another boost. And I had a friend who was an elected official at the time, whose name I will not mention, but this guy couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. So I went to him and I said, I need to tell you something, but you cannot tell a soul. Oh, I swear I won't tell anybody. And I said, Bob has asked me to be his campaign manager. Oh, that's great. You can't tell anybody. Oh, don't worry. Man, I was getting phone calls that afternoon from people congratulating me. And again, it gave the story a boost because I had reporters call me. I'm like, well, I really can't comment on that right now. and so in February, I left my job as caucus director to run Fob's campaign. And a month later, Fob comes to me and says, I'm not going to do this. I'm not running. And what had happened that kind of goosed him a little bit the first go around was I had gone back through all the elections in Alabama from 1978 through 1992. And I showed him how the counties that he carried in 78 and that he did well in 86, that by 90, all his votes had moved to the Republican primary. And Fob was an engineer, he's a numbers guy. So I sent him a little, this was before Excel, so I just did it in Word, but a document that had the 78 election, the 86 election, the 90 election, and then the elections in between, and just showed him all his votes were going in different directions. We're coming to the Republican primary. So anyway, he decides he's going to run, then he decides he's not. So I go back to my job with the caucus at the State House. And I mean, I'd walk down the halls and people were laughing at me going, oh, there goes Fob James, campaign manager. Where's your candidate? And on Monday before qualifying ended, it was on Thursday, 8 days before qualifying ended. Fob calls me. I'm in Montgomery. Fob calls me and says, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm working, back at the caucus and working on a couple of campaigns. And he says, well, I may need you back. I've got a meeting with some folks and they're doing some polling and I might can win this thing. And he said, I'm meeting with them on Tuesday. I'll call you on Tuesday and let you know. So of course he doesn't call me on Tuesday. He calls me like Wednesday or Thursday and says, well, if nothing happens to change my mind, I'm going to qualify for governor. And I've got reporters calling me and I'm leaking a little bit of information. And all week long, at that time, WRC did a half-hour news break, AM 960 here in Birmingham. And their radio guy every day, Neil Vickers, every day it was like, what's Fob James going to do? What's Fob James going to do? And so on Thursday, he says, look, meet me at my son's office over in Vestavia And if nothing happens between now and then to change my mind, I'm going to run. So I met him at the office and at his son's office, and he tells me, okay, well, if nothing happens to change my mind before I get to the Republican Party headquarters, I'm going to run. And but he built a fever pitch anticipation because the whole state was there. There were TV cameras from all over the state at the Republican Party headquarters, which had never happened on qualifying before. And Bob walks in, he and I walked in together, he qualifies, and the next day we had a rally in Montgomery, and it was almost like an old time tent revival. There was just electricity in the air. There was real excitement and anticipation about Bob running for governor, and we blitzed through the Republican primary. He got 40-something% in the primary, and then got 65% or 2/3 of the vote in the runoff, and won the election by 10,000 votes.
I remember how you said it, how it was. I mean, that anticipation, because it was like I kept waiting, because there was a guy in 1990 told me, he said, and I swear he told me, he said, Bob's going to run for governor as a Republican next time, and it's going to be between him and Charlie Graddick, talking about 94. And I thought, wow. But Bob, I mean, but I remember how this kept waiting and waiting and waiting. Yeah. And funny story real quick, they went to a psychic and asked her who was going to be the next governor. And she predicted that Paul Hubbard was going to defeat Jim Folsom Jr. and he would defeat Winton Blunt that year. And then the end of the article said, but one name or one face stuck out to her who's not yet or may not yet ever be a candidate. She said, I like him best. And she had pointed at Governor James. And he had I believe, and I never doubted this through the summer or anything, but at the Labor Day traditional kickoff, he trailed Governor Folsom by 13 points.
Yeah.
And you know, I mean, 49-36, and Governor Folsom kept a steady, hard lead. And I remember the final poll on Sunday, before Tuesday, Governor Folsom had a 5-point lead. I still never wavered.
I'm trying to remember his campaign consultant, Governor Folsom's campaign consultant. It was a guy out of Washington, a guy out of Texas, and I can't remember his name. He was a nationally known Democrat operative, and he left Alabama 3 weeks out and said, "You guys got this. I'm going to go to Texas and see if I can salvage Ann Richardson." And they wound up losing both of them. I want to say Bob Shrum, but I'm not sure that's right or not.
A surgeon at that time.
So we had we had polled early in the year because Bob wasn't sure. I mean, he just wasn't sure he wanted to run, and he wasn't. And if he ran, he didn't know if he's going to run as a Democrat, an independent, or a Republican.
I remember that they did some polling for him as an independent running.
And Larry Powell, I don't know if you know Larry or not, professor at UAB.
Yeah.
Larry was in Florida then working for a polling firm, and we hired him to poll this race, and it showed if he ran for governor as a Democrat in that Hubbard-Folsom race, that he wouldn't crack 20% in the Democrat primary. If he ran as an independent, he would get about 25% of the vote and basically ensure that Jim Folsom or Paul Hubbard was the next governor, or was elected governor. And that if he ran as a Republican, that he could win the Republican primary, but if everything went right, if everything went perfect, his ceiling was 51%.
Wow.
And everything pretty much went perfect, and Bob got 50.5%. So that convinced me Larry was a pretty good pollster.
I think one of the things that put him over the edge, and it was perfect, man, is holding on to that ad about Governor Folsom and McGregor going to the Cayman Islands on the last day, and it just ran. And Governor Folsom didn't have a chance to respond. And you've got a 2-3 point race right there, and you've got an ad running like that constantly all day, and you can't respond. I mean, that was a brilliant move.
Well, I worked on the campaign. I was campaign manager through the primary and runoff, and I left the campaign. I left the campaign manager's position and stayed on a consultant basis, and I went back and oversaw legislative races. In the House, we had targeted 13 races, and I managed to raise, I think, $25,000 that we spread out amongst these guys. And we won 8 House seats, which was the most numerically and percentage-wise, the largest number of seats Republicans ever took. And that was in 1994. And that stood until 2010 when the Democrat dominance in the legislature just crumbled.
You know, I remember that day they said 12 o'clock news came on, and Fob just voted this big smile on his face because the exit polls had him with a 52% of the vote. And I remember watching that race that night. I mean, it was so close. And I guess about 12 o'clock, Fob went ahead. And it'd been close, but he gained a small lead. And then about 2 a.m., they said they were going to stop counting until the next morning. It was too close to call. They were sending his head of his ballot security team was sending somebody to stand beside every ballot box in the state until they resumed counting. And then, you know, Governor Folsom just conceded that next morning. I was like, I told you he did it. It was 10,000 votes. So then when Fob comes off, and I guess he set the tone right away with the 10th Amendment hanging under the podium. Was he a states' rights type governor his first time? Because I can't remember that. I mean,
no, he was, as a matter of fact, he was labeled a pretty progressive governor the first time, but he had taken a pretty hard turn to the right by the time he got elected in 92. And I was focused on, I was not at their victory party in 94. I was gathering results for election returns on legislative races that night because we won some races that nobody thought we would win. But I was campaign manager for the primary and runoff, and Bob didn't like doing television a lot. He just didn't enjoy doing interviews. And so he sent me out. And that's, you know, now you'll have a pool reporter for, I mean, one station owns Channel 6, Channel 12 in Montgomery, and one of the Huntsville or Mobile stations. I think I can't remember, but but then every television station in the state sent somebody out, and I spent the evening going up and down that road doing television interviews during the primary and the runoff, and then Bob would just come out and make his speech. So, I mean, the way Bob liked to do things created a lot of opportunity for me as far as building relationships and getting to know people that served me well through my entire political career. So,
one other thing about Bob, and I'll move on to that. You talked about he didn't want to be governor. I always got the feeling that Bob was the type of guy that he loved to campaign, but he didn't like being governor. And then in that 98 race, when he got forced into that runoff with Winton Blunt, you could just tell he didn't have the fire in his belly going into the fall.
Yeah, it was. It was. I think a point of difference in Bob and myself as I've aged is people used to campaign on fixing government. And you don't fix government, you manage government. And you learn to manage it. You can keep it small and manage it, but you can't just go tinker with it and do something and then walk away and it's going to stay fixed. And I don't think he had he didn't enjoy the governing aspect of things. And the first go around, there were a lot of reforms that he brought because he had a Democrat legislature, he's a Democrat governor, and he had a bunch of allies that would work with him. Second go around, the legislature wasn't coming to his office and saying, "What do you want us to do?"
Governor Sigelman was fighting him pretty hard too, because I know he wanted to.
Yes.
But you're so right. When Alabama was not ready for a female governor at that time with Ann Bledsoe, and Winton Blunt did not connect with the African voter.
And Ann was not in the mainstream of Republican thought. She was way moderate on some issues that were important to Republican voters. Nice lady, loved her dearly, but she was not a social conservative.
That second go around, there, and I still watch it sometimes. It's one of the greatest ads ever Bob ran, and it talks about the accomplishments are just showing up in the back and Alabama flags waving, but you can hear this voice and he says something along the lines. I think it's fair to say when his team came into office, they found state government in shambles. He passed major legislation to our courts. He's added the money to our schools. He's running an honest administration. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the governor of Alabama, Governor Bob James. And then he goes, "Well, thank you, Winton. I'm deeply honored by your kind words."
Yeah.
So when did you make your first run for political office?
Okay, so I was director of the caucus when Bob hired me to be his campaign manager, and I went back to that when I left the campaign, and he offered me a job as his legislative office. I wouldn't have even been in charge. I would have just been, and I just didn't want to move to Montgomery. So the tax collector in Jefferson County had been charged with extortion. And they worked out a plea deal that he pled guilty to a misdemeanor and resigned from office. And he was a Democrat, but Fobb had appointed him when he was governor the first time. And so he felt like he owed it to Fobb to put that in his hands. So Fobb, he worked it out with the judge that he would resign effective January 31st or February 1st, something like that, after the election was over. And that announcement was made in early January. And I went to a WIR meeting that night and bumped into Tony Patelis and Johnny Curry and Mark Gaines and Alan Sanders, who were some of my closest friends who were also legislators. And one of them said, and they were talking about this vacancy that had just occurred. And one of them said, "You need to get Fobb to appoint you tax collector." And I'm like, "He's not going to appoint me tax collector." And they're like, "Sure he will." And Tony's wife, Teresa, who later became a judge, was the assistant tax collector in the Bessemer cutoff at the time. And he said, "Yeah, you can do this." And he called Teresa over and she talked to me about the job. And so all the Jefferson County, all with one exception, all the Jefferson County legislators signed a letter asking the governor to appoint me tax collector. He appointed me. As a matter of fact, I was on my way. This was not everybody had cell phones then. I'm on my way to Tuscaloosa to a basketball game, and I'm with a friend of mine who I won't name because we were sitting on the side of the road. He just got stopped for speeding, and I was married at the time, and my wife texted me, and I borrowed his cell phone, and I called her back, and she said, "We just got a call from a reporter looking for biographical information on you. Did you get appointed tax collector?" And I said, "Not that I know of." So I called the governor's press secretary. It was Donnie Claxton, and I said, "Donnie," I said, "I am not trying to pressure you or put any. I'm not trying to get any inside knowledge, but a reporter has called me looking for biographical data on me. Have I been appointed tax collector?" And he said, "Nobody's called you?" And I said, "No." And he goes, "Damn," because I've already sent out the press release. and so I had agreed, I had promised Alan Collins, who at the time was at Channel 42, and we're doing this podcast that'll be aired later, but tonight is Alan's last night on television. He's retiring from Channel 6, the end of a real storied career. But I got to the ball game and I called Alan, and 42 broke the news that night. And so the next morning, I went down to Judge Cahill's office and got sworn in as tax collector and walked into the office. I had never even been in the office before. I didn't know anybody there. And I walked in, and I had been told that my chief deputy was 8.5 months pregnant. So I walked in, and I'm looking for a very pregnant woman. And one of the clerks sees me kind of looking around confused. And she says, "Can I help you, sir?" And I said, "Well, my name is Jack Williams." And all of a sudden, this pregnant lady shows up out of nowhere, and she says, "Okay, everybody pay attention. We got a boss now." And they set me down, and she said, "Give me 2 days," because I got there on a Thursday. And about 2 o'clock that afternoon, I got a call from the governor's office telling me I'd been appointed tax collector. So I had 2 days for her to tell me everything she knew. And on Monday, she had a baby and was out for the next 12 weeks. And my staff did an incredible job of helping me get acclimated. And so I had 2 years. I ran and was reelected, and then served for 8.5 years. And the next time I ran, I got beat. And I really, yes, JT Smallwood beat me, who is still the tax collector in Jefferson County, and a dear friend of mine. JT's a wonderful guy.
Ask you a quick question right there. I don't mean to cut you off, but I keep meaning to ask politicians this, and I always forget. When I talk to somebody and they talk about one of their opponents, and I mean, being a brutal race, and they're like, "Oh, we're still good friends to this day." How are these guys still good friends like that?
I would say most of the people that I've run against, I have good relationships with. Yeah, some of the campaigns were bruising.
Like Bill and Charles say they're great friends to this day. And I'm like, oh.
I don't know. You just a couple of things. One is, as time passes, it becomes less important. And sometimes as time passes, the guy that wins wishes the other guy had won. And and the guy that lost is looking at what the guy that won went through and goes, "Oh my God, I'm glad I'm not having to deal with that." So, but I would say most of the people that I've been in contested races with, I have a pretty decent relationship with now. There's probably one guy that doesn't care for me, but nothing I can do about that. So,
What did you do after the defeat?
I looked for a job. I had talked to one of the banks about being a national representative for them. They had a large footprint, and I had been the first vice president of the National Association of County Treasurers and Finance Officers, and I had been the president of the National Conference of Republican County Officials. So I had a good national network, and there was a group at the bank that really wanted to hire me, and the accountants were like, well, we got no way to judge if this will make money for us. So they passed, and it was probably a good thing. My dad was in really bad health. I left office on October 1st, and I spent the next 2.5 months taking care of my dad. And we buried him on Christmas Eve in 2003. And so the first two, if I had walked, I certainly wanted to walk out of there and into a job, but if I had it, I don't know if my dad, I was his primary caregiver, and he lived 55 miles away. So I spent a lot of nights sleeping in hospital rooms. So I came out and kind of worked on getting a real estate business started. And I worked on that for over a year. And we kind of scraped by. And in the spring of 2004, I had someone call me and tell me that my legislator was in really bad health, which was not surprising news. And he died in June, and I was actually in New York when he died. And he died in June. And I had a very good friend that wanted to run. As a matter of fact, I was with him this guy earlier today at lunch. And so we started making plans for his campaign. And he was going to have to quit his job to run. And his wife didn't want him to do that. And he shows up at my house one night looking so relaxed. And this was about the end of June. We'd been in this conversation for 3 weeks probably. And I said, and we're going to start writing campaign material that night. And I said, you ready to start work? He says, well, let's talk first. I said, okay. And he goes, I've decided not to run. I want you to run. So I sat down with my family, and we agreed that we would pursue that. And in 2002, when I lost the tax collector's race, I fully expected to win.
Hey, let me ask you one question before we go into the next note.
Sure.
What exactly does tax collector do? I mean, they go around local businesses and collect the money that they.
We collect not sales tax; it's business personal property tax,
right.
And it's property taxes on homes, land, real estate. It's real estate taxes. Right. So I really expected to win, and JT did a really good campaign. Had a lot of union support, which cut into my base, and I really worked hard to try and cut into the Black community. And he felt like if he could cut into the blue collar white vote, he could beat me. And I felt like if I could cut into the Black vote, I could beat him. And he just did a better job of cutting into my base than I did cutting into his. He got about 12%. He probably got about an additional 12% of the white vote than the Democrat typically did at that time, and I only got about 8% of the. bested the typical black turnout by about 8%. And he won by less than 3,000 votes. So it was 50 point something to 49 point something. But had I won, I probably wouldn't have been able to run for the legislature. But I had expected to win, and election day, my primary rolled around. So in 2004, Tony Vitalis ran for mayor of Hoover, and I was his campaign.
Okay.
What's that?
When we cut, let me tell you a story about him.
All right. When Tony decided to run for mayor, and I was his campaign manager, and this vacancy occurred while I was running his campaign. So I sat down with Tony and his wife Teresa and said, "Well, what do y'all think?" And they said, "You're going to quit and run for the legislature, aren't you?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to quit. This is my only income I got." And I said, "I'd like to run, but I'm not going to leave y'all high and dry." And Tony said, "Well, I think I'm going to win, and I think you can win, and we can do a lot for our area with me as mayor and you in the legislature." So I split my time between the campaigns, and Tony wound up in a runoff. And the runoff was the week before my primary because I was in a special election. And I spoke to a group. Two things that happened in that race. There was a guy that ran that had not run for office before. And one day, Tony and I were sitting there having lunch, and the receptionist comes in and says, "Tony, there's somebody here to see you." And now Tony and I go back. This was '94. We've been friends for over 10 years. We've been friends since 1982, and good friends. I mean, like our families hung out together. Our kids were friends. So
yeah, y'all really good friends.
Yeah, and we had a really tight group of political people back then, and we're still all friends today. So receptionist comes up and says, "There's somebody out front to see you," and he said, "Well, tell them to come on back." And the guy comes walking in, and it's my opponent that has never run for office before. And here Tony and I are sitting there yucking it up, eating lunch and laughing. And he is just crestfallen because it's like, oh no. And so we fast forward a week and a half to Tony's runoff, and I'm speaking to a group, and my speech ends a few minutes after the polls close. And I get to my car, and Tony's wife's on the phone calling me saying, "Get over here. One of your opponents is here, and you need to be around Tony." So I showed up, and I can't get within 10 feet of Tony. And about the time I got there, the last box came in. Tony's won by 2-1, 66% of the vote. And he starts walking around the room, and I'm kind of trying to get to him to speak to him. And I can't get to him because he keeps moving. So I decided to circle back this way, and he comes around and I come around, and we meet, and he sees me and he throws open his arms, and we embrace. And about the time we shook hands and then embraced, and about the time we start to shake hands, I feel something hot on my face, and I realize all the TV cameras had turned their lights on. So what led the 10 o'clock news that night, a week before my primary, was me embracing the new mayor of Hoover. And that certainly helped. And election night rolls around, and I really didn't know if I was going to win or lose. I was afraid to get too cocky. And the first box came in, and I had I got 42% of the vote. The next guy got 31, and then the next guy got 27. And that's how the race ended that night. By the time all 8 boxes had come in, I had 40. It was 42, 31, 27, and but when the first box came in, I knew I was going to win. And I did. Served 2 years. Had my toughest race, and won with 53% of the vote, and then was fortunate to win 2 more times. So.
What's it like to lose a close race, and then what's it like to win a close one?
I prefer winning to losing.
Yeah.
The really hard thing on the race that I lost, let's see, my boys were 10 and 7 then, and it never crossed my mind that I would lose. And I lost. And I had to bring them in the bathroom of the hotel where we were doing our victory party and tell them I lost. And they were devastated. I mean, they just sat in the bathroom and cried.
Oh God.
But when the 2004 special election came around, now, okay, so my primary was September 21st. My runoff was the week before the presidential election. And then my general election was November 30th. So, or something, it was September, October, and November were the races. And I'd go knock on doors and I'd say, remind you to go vote next Tuesday. And they're like, the election's not next Tuesday. I said, this is a special election. And so election day, I'd done everything I could. And this is primary day. And about 4 o'clock, I just convinced myself I was going to lose. And I was depressed by the time we got ready to go to the victory party. And of course, I won. And then I had a really tight race 2 years later. And I made the mistake of going out, putting up signs the night before. And my opponent had signs everywhere. And I felt so bad the next day that about 2 o'clock, I just went to bed and pulled the covers up over my head. And I stayed in bed for about 3 hours because it was like, oh, I'm going to get beat. I just know I'm going to get beat. And I won. And after that, my next 2 races, we were doing track and polling. So I knew what was going to happen. So I didn't have those emotional ups and downs.
So when you got left the legislature to run for the commission, was you tired of time in Montgomery? Because I heard people say they just hate it.
I tell folks that I left the legislature for health reasons. I was sick of it. So my last 4 years, I just grew increasingly tired of the showmanship and just, you know, we were in charge, and you know, the easiest to me, one of the easiest things I ever did was be in the legislature for when we were in the minority, because you're just throwing bombs. I mean, whatever they're for, you're against, and you can go up and talk. So you know, and but
on that long, how did they do that? I mean, because everybody think it went Republican, and they held on to the legislature.
Well, they were drawing the lines.
Oh, okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, and
okay.
But when we took over, I mean, we had to govern. We had to make important decisions, and they weren't always easy decisions. And I had I was a committee chairman, and it was a lot of work, but I enjoyed it. But I just reached a point where I was ready to do something different. And when I decided, I decided in May of 2014, before my 2014 primary, I knew I was not going to run for the legislature in 2018. And finished out that year and ran for the county commission. And I had a friend qualified to run against me. And I told my kids, you know, it's Steve Ammons, who is the Jefferson County Commissioner in that district now. And I told my kids, you know, more than anybody else, and not to say other guys couldn't, because I feel like they could, but I said more so than anybody else, I think Steve is better prepared for this office than anybody that's ever run against me before. And if he won, I would not be in any way be concerned about the future of the county, because I think he'd do a good job. And of course, I didn't think he would win. And of course, I had some bizarre things occur that spring that derailed that campaign. And we're not going to get into details on it, but my indictment, and I was thrilled being under a federal indictment to get 38% of the vote. Because I know Steve, I know Steve, and I know that 38% of the people don't dislike him. So I knew some people voted for me because they actually believed in me and liked
me. Yeah, that's a pretty good amount of votes to get there. I mean, you know, everybody's, and I paged in the house, and I could see where it would just be just a nightmare down there. In fact, I hated so much the third day. I just walked around and started going into everybody's office I could have talked to, and I remember that's when Governor Hunt was actually under indictment, and I walked around a corner and ran into George Wallace Jr. and almost knocked him down. and and so I went back in his office later and talked to him, and you know, I remember that like in 86, 90, just it seemed like this guy was the rising star. And then in 92, Bill Dickinson, a seat that's been Republican for 28 years. Why do you take that chance on that? I mean, on that seat? I mean, if you ran as a Republican, yeah, you probably would. Yeah, but you're going to run against a seat that's been a solid Republican for that long?
You know, I guess you grow up in it, and it's just hard because I mean, these juniors that have put their name out there, Jim, George, they're not Bernie Sanders Democrats. They're Joe Manchin Democrats. But it just reached a point where folks weren't going to vote for a Democrat.
Yeah, I think that and I was telling somebody that totally just ruined him, because sometimes when you lose an election like that, you just get this stigma on you that just and I think too that I was telling somebody that again, I like George Jr. That at first the name was a help, but then it became a detriment because he was not his father. He was not that fiery, go fight them guy. Just they were just different people. But I think that race just totally killed him. Because I remember in 2006 too. When he was going, I was actually friends with one of Folsom's nephews, and I was so pumped in the spring because I'm thinking, man, it's going to be Folsom versus Wallace, for the lieutenant governor's race. And he said, I don't think so. And this was like in February. And I said, what do you mean? He said, there's this guy in Mountain Brook we think is going to beat him. I said, no, this guy's not going to beat George Wallace Jr. And then I've read that what you said about the Joe Manchin Democrats, that he had did a lot of populist things that were helpful to the people on the PSC, and he made a lot of Republicans mad, and they came out. That's why he ended up losing that race.
Yeah. Well, it's a being named after being a namesake only helps you if your daddy's still popular or your party's still popular. And
yeah,
in for these two guys, neither of those were true at the time. And had they been named Ralph and Frank, they might have had a different persuasion because they wouldn't have felt locked into. I don't know one way or the other, but it would have allowed them a little bit of freedom. I mean, I understand that. I'm named after my dad. He was principal of the school I went to for 10 out of 12 years, and pastor of the church I went to for about 14 years. And I moved to Birmingham and kind of made my own life. And his shadow was big in the community we lived in, but it didn't bleed over to Jefferson County.
A former Birmingham city councilman that I'm good friends with told me that Jim Folsom Jr. was the best politician he'd ever seen. And I said, why? He said, he could put on a pair of overalls and go up here to the county co-op and talk to farmers.
Yeah.
Then put a suit on and go over here and talk to the Mountain Brook Country Club. And then go over there to a black church and give the same message to all three audiences and connect with all three of them.
I think Jim is comfortable in any of those situations. He's probably, I think George Jr. is a little more astute politically. Jim's a little better retail politician, would be my comparison of the two. But I think they're both good guys. So.
But I could tell talking to you this time that I have something in common with you that my favorite thing that is looking at is numbers and trends and patterns and those types of things. And, I did that a lot in past races and did that for somebody not too long ago for a race. And a couple years ago, I was kind of somebody's de facto advisor for a race. And I told them, I said, I understand you have to go meet with party officials, but we're driving 5 hours to go to whatever county, and you're speaking to 20 people and spending 2 minutes. I said, you live here in Birmingham, get up every morning and go to these Jacks and these Hardee's, these McDonald's and these, I said, there's 160-year-old men and 60-year-old women in there that's holding court, about they want to do something and get things changed. That's where your voters are. That's how these people do great.
I'll tell you, whoever told you that Jim Folsom was the best retail politician they'd ever met, never met John Merrill.
Really?
Because wherever folks are, John's going to show up. I mean, it is unbelievable. He has a capacity to go. He is the Energizer Bunny, and I would be surprised if he will not be a candidate in 22, but I'd be surprised if we didn't see something out of John in the future.
One of the guy, and I'm still friends with him. We talked last night. Is Troy King. I mean, I like Troy. I mean, everybody, I hear other things, but it's like, and I said, I like Troy. I sit there and talk to him for hours. And I really thought he was going to win in 2018 because here's what I was basing it on numbers. Troy had won 60% of the vote in that district. Even when he lost in 2010 to Luther, he won 60% of the vote in that district.
Yeah.
When he lost to Marshall, or I'm talking when he ran for Congress, when he he won 60% of the vote in that district. So I said, he's going to win this thing. They went out a runoff, and sometimes it just doesn't work out the way we hoped. I've kept a lot of your time, Jack. I'm not going to go anymore.
Well, I've enjoyed it. Now you know more about me than you ever cared to know.
I'll tell you one story we cut filming, but anyway, everyone, thank you. I'm going to this helped me out a lot.
All right, my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, sir.